Your Excellency, Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, President of the 73rd Session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your Excellency, Ms. Amal Mudalali, Permanent Representative of Lebanon and Vice Chairperson of the United Nations Committee on Information. Your Excellency, Ms. Fatima Kyary Muhammad, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations. Ms. Valeria Robecco, President of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Excellencies, distinguished ambassadors, members of the media and NGO communities, youth participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and happy World Press Freedom Day. My name is Alison Smale and I'm the Under-Secretary General for Global Communications. Today is an important day. As a former journalist, the cause of press freedom has long been close to my heart. First, it is my honor to invite Her Excellency, Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, President of the General Assembly, to deliver her message. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Alison. Let me acknowledge Your Excellency Amal Mudalali, Permanent Representative of Lebanon to the United Nations and Vice Chair of the General Assembly Committee on Information, Excellency Fatima Kyary Muhammad, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations, dear Alison Smale, Undersecretary General for Global Communications, and dear Valeria Robecco, President of the UN Correspondents Association, Excellencies, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Just so for you to acknowledge this beautiful panel of all women, in this very important Press Freedom Day. And I am indeed very grateful to the Department for Global Communications and UNESCO for organizing this event to mark the World Press Freedom Day and for giving me the opportunity to address you today. I do so, and I have to say, with a heavy heart. Last year, the UNESCO Observatory recorded the murder of 99 journalists. Hundreds of media workers have been intimidated or imprisoned. Reporters Without Borders chose to give its 2019 World Press Freedom Index the title, A Cycle of Fear. That doesn't give us great hope. This day should be a celebration of journalists, editors, photographers, filmmakers, publishers, policymakers, of all those who contribute to and create the conditions for a free, pluralistic, and independent media. But it has also become a sobering occasion as the media space shrinks across the world, as restrictive laws and policies are enacted. It has become a chilling occasion as media workers and their families are subjected to threats and reprisals. And in so many fields, women are disproportionately affected, contending with sexist abuse and sexual harassment online, as well as physical sexual violence, including rape. Too often, these attacks go unpunished. At a time when nationalist populism and extremism are on the rise, when hate speech, rumors, and lies can spread like wildfire, we need journalism, high-quality journalism, independent and diverse media more than ever. It is journalists who shine a spotlight on abuse and corruption. It is journalists who tell the stories that need to be told. It is journalists who can give voice to those whom nobody listens. It is journalists who hold up a mirror to society. And if we don't like what we see, our response should be to address the issues, not shoot the messenger. Dear friends, I commend UNESCO to its effort to defend the media from attacks, to support a free, vibrant, and diverse press, and to protect and promote press freedom working with governments, regulators, media organizations, and non-government organizations. And to all the journalists out there working hard to uncover the truth and to cover the stories, bad and good, that we need to hear. And I thank you. Have a very happy Press Freedom Day. Thank you. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you, Excellency, for your poignant and strong thoughts on the value of a free press and ensuring the safety of media workers. As President of the General Assembly, you have another pressing engagement to attend, so you must leave us at this time. Thank you so much for coming. The Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, regrets that he, too, could not join us today, so he has sent us this video message.
The free press is essential for peace, justice, sustainable development, and human rights. No democracy is complete without access to transparent and reliable information. It is the cornerstone for building fair and impartial institutions, holding leaders accountable, and speaking truth to power. And this is especially true during election seasons, the focus of this year's World Press Freedom Day. Facts, not falsehoods, should guide people as they choose their representatives. Yet, while technology has transformed the ways in which we receive and share information, sometimes it is used to mislead public opinion or to fuel violence and hatred. Civic space has been shrinking worldwide at an alarming rate. And with anti-media rhetoric on the rise, so too are violence and harassment against journalists, including women. I'm deeply troubled by the growing number of attacks and the culture of impunity. According to UNESCO, almost 100 journalists were killed in 2018. Hundreds are imprisoned. And when media workers are targeted, societies as a whole pay a price. On World Press Freedom Day, I call on all to defend the rights of journalists whose efforts help us to build a better world for all. Thank you.
Taking note of the powerful messages we've already heard, I'd like to remind you that this year's theme for World Press Freedom Day is Media for Democracy, Journalism and Elections in Times of Disinformation. Our discussion will focus on the importance of press freedom and freedom of expression to the foundations of democracy in a digital age. This will be a timely and crucial discussion as journalism still faces a multitude of threats, including censorship, intimidation, and direct physical attacks against the lives and livelihoods of journalists and media workers. Today, we stand in solidarity with journalists and media workers. We remember those who have been killed in the line of duty, and we reaffirm our commitment to the right of freedom of expressions as well as a free, independent, and pluralistic media. An independent media is central to democracy. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that the right of freedom of opinion and expression includes the right to seek and receive, quote, information and ideas through any media, unquote. In fact, access to information and the treatment of media personnel are reflected in the targets and indicator of Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals. These fundamental rights of expression and to opinion could not be more crucial in elections. When the press operates unencumbered, it informs and helps to keep governments accountable to their citizens. We now inhabit a digital world where internet access, social media platforms, and smartphones create instant access to breaking news. In this context, the moniker fake news has become a catchphrase to discredit journalists and the news stories they report on. As I mentioned during a panel discussion earlier this week, I cannot emphasize enough that fake news is a misnomer. If it's fake, it cannot possibly be news. Emerging technologies have opened the door to new opportunities to revolutionize civic engagement and elections. At the same time, burgeoning challenges require vigorous and innovative solutions to protect these universal principles, as well as our democratic processes and institutions. The media must be able to operate freely across the globe, for when it does, it can protect democracy. Each of us, no matter where we live, shares in this responsibility to protect, uphold, and defend these freedoms. This year marks the 26th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, a day proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in 1993. The raison d'être for the day is as critical as ever. The digital era connects us together in ways that we could not have dreamed of only a few decades ago. Arguably, in a way, we are all citizen journalists. In this spirit of interconnectedness, I ask you to never forget the sacrifices that are being made by professional journalists everywhere and every day to deliver accurate and transparent information about the world in which we live. Thank you so much for listening, and I am sure the sessions ahead will provide engaging and dynamic opportunities for discussion. Those who cannot be here physically present with us can add their voices via social media using the handles and hashtags you will see on screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Amal Mudalali, Permanent Representative of Lebanon to the United Nations and Vice Chair of UN Committee on Information. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. This means that you really care. I thank UNESCO and the Department of Global Communications for organizing this important and timely event on the occasion of World Freedom Day. I'm honored to be here with the PGA, who just left us, and also with USG, Ms. Alison Smale, and with my sister, Her Excellency Fatima Muhammad, the Ambassador of the African Union, the United Nations, and Ms. Valeria Robecco, ANSA News Agency and President of the United Nations Correspondents Association. I would also like to welcome here among us the former spokesman for the United Nations, Mr. Samir Sambar, who launched this day. Thank you. Freedom of press and freedom of speech has been very personal for me. It's so personal that it defined me and a generation of Lebanese as well as Arab journalists for over 4 decades. It all started with a hand dipped in acid. Lebanese journalist Salim Lawzi was the most prominent journalist in the Arab world back then, when I was dreaming of studying journalism and becoming a journalist in the early 80s. Then he was kidnapped and disappeared. When he was found killed, it was not killing him that shocked the people. It was his right hand. It was dipped in acid and destroyed. Journalists then wrote in longhand and did not use computers. The message for every journalist and anyone aspiring to be a journalist was in his hand. It simply said, "This is what happens to you when you write what we don't like." In the last decades, the media and the world of communications went through a sea change. The internet entered our lives, and as Bill Gates put it, gave voice to people who would never have been heard. We started living in an instant world, and the news shrunk to 140 characters, spreading at a dizzying speed. The tablet and the cell phone made every person with one an instant journalist, and the media was never the same again. It changed what we know about the world and how we know it, making every news story a local one with the same speed and intensity. That few years ago would have taken days or months to reach us. The power of the media and its reach made it as important in society and in politics as governments, if not more sometimes. We thought the media would live its golden age. We thought with that power of the medium, we get immunity for its messengers. But unfortunately, not much has changed for journalists and for freedom of the press the world over. Actually, freedom of the press is living some of the worst days in terms of threats and violence against journalists. In 2018, and as the PGA mentioned, killing the messenger was the preferred way to get rid of the message, and violence against journalists reached unprecedented levels and prompted the New York Times to call it the worst time in recent history in which to be a journalist. Last year, and according to Reporters Without Borders, 348 journalists were detained, 80 were killed. This is 89% increase over the year before, and 60 were held hostages. But what was unsettling was the fact that attacks on journalists were on the rise everywhere in the world, including in the traditionally safe and liberal democracies that has the rights of freedom of expression enshrined in its constitutions. But it was not only violence. Inflammatory rhetoric against journalists reached unprecedented levels of incitement also. Trust in the media is also a flat low at 44%, according to Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Actually, in the United States, the Knight Foundation found that 90% of adults say their trust in the news media has fallen in the last decade. We also live in the age of fake news and disinformation. Actors from governments to political parties and groups and individuals use the social media to disseminate hyper-partisan content and sometimes hate. This is very bad news for all of us, especially for democracy, for our freedoms, for our politics, for our lives, and for the future of democracy everywhere. The media is very important for liberty and for our freedoms. It's hard to think of a free society or free people if their right to know the facts is taken away from them. It's the media and journalists who help us make choices, educated ones, whether in politics or elections, by giving us the facts and shedding light on the truth. This is how democracy thrives, through informed and enlightened citizens who make the right choice after studying all the options and knowing all the facts. That's why the Washington Post is right to choose its slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." I was impressed on a trip to Roosevelt Island yesterday by how the late President Roosevelt put freedom of speech and expression as the first pillar of his 4 essential human freedoms that the future world should be founded on. This was 1941. It is in this building where the will of the world is reflected and gathered that these pillars of the foundation of the future of our world should be strengthened and maintained. It's here that we need to insist, through speaking out and through binding resolutions and through example, to defend the defenders of our freedoms, the journalists, and safeguard press freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and every freedom, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, to quote the former president. This is the world that we want to live in. This is the world where democracy, human rights, and dignity can live and flourish. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for a passionate and strong defense of the reasons why we need a free press. It is now my honor to invite Her Excellency Ms. Fatima Kyary Muhammad, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations, to deliver her message. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to stand on existing protocols. Let me begin by thanking UNESCO and the UN Department of Global Communications for bringing us together here at the UN headquarters on this World Press Freedom Day. There are almost 100 events taking place worldwide to mark this important day. I'd also like to thank the USG, the PGA, and my sister Amal for her very, very powerful remarks, highlighting the realities of the challenges faced by journalists today. I think the stories and the figures that you presented really bring the reality home. In fact, as I'm sitting here today, the global conference event has been taking place since Wednesday at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. And the conference is jointly organized by UNESCO, the government of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, and the African Union Commission, which I represent. This is the first time a regional organization partners with UNESCO on this endeavor. Today, as we celebrate Press Freedom Day, which marks the anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration adopted on May 3rd in 1991 by African journalists as a call for an independent and pluralistic African press, the UNESCO General Conference then recommended this International Day to the UN General Assembly, who proclaimed it in 1993. The theme for World Press Freedom Day in 2019, Media for Democracy, Journalism, and Elections in Times of Disinformation, concerns the current challenges faced by the media in times of elections and the growing prevalence of disinformation, along with the media's potential to support democracy, peace, and reconciliation. This commemoration theme is closely interlinked with the objectives of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the African Union's Agenda 2063, which under Aspiration 3 envisions an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law, and specifically earmarks under it a specific goal on democratic values, practices, universal principles of human rights, justice, and the rule of law entrenched. This is one of the priority areas to be realized by 2023. Similarly, the SDG 16 underscores the importance of public access to information and fundamental freedoms. This includes freedom of expression. SDG 16 recognizes that peace and democracy are preconditions for equitable and sustainable development. When freedom of expression and safety of journalists are protected, the media can play a vital role in preventing conflict and in supporting peaceful democratic processes. These outcomes are conditions for the realization of Africa's Agenda 2063 as well. The SDGs themselves encapsulate media's potential to promote peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. SDG Target 16.10 urges UN member states to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. The two indicators to follow progress under Target 16.10 cover the safety of journalists and the legal and political guarantees to access information. These indicators show that under the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, the institutions of a free and safe press are a substantive component of peaceful societies. It follows that a free and safe press must be able to access and disseminate information of public interest without fear of attack. Since today we will be looking into how the digital era is affecting electoral communications, it is important to also consider what can be done to counter rhetorical and other attacks on journalism, including during elections. One effect of aggressive rhetoric is to blur the line between legitimate critique of media and naked threats which violate the right of journalists to exercise freedom of expression. Yet, the safety of journalists is fundamental to whether an election can be considered as free and fair. Rapid political and judicial responses are needed at all times to address impunity for crimes against journalists, and these are particularly relevant during an election period. Recent resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council and UNESCO have urged member states to create monitoring mechanisms under the SDG framework in order to track the safety of journalists. The importance of having free and safe professional journalism in an election is highlighted against the background of social media and social messaging where disinformation flourishes. Artificial intelligence is already being applied in social media content moderation. Automated chatbots are delivering propaganda material. These raise questions of hidden agenda-setting influence. Emerging debates about the ethical, technological, political, social, and legal implications of the use of AI needs to be linked to freedom of expression broadly and in elections in particular. On the positive side, however, digital technologies are enhancing the right to information, which is also an important issue for elections. the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has developed broad guidelines relevant to this topic. These recommend steps to enhance information access by election management bodies, political parties, and candidates, as well as regulatory bodies that cover media and internet operations. Transparency proposals are also made for internet companies and for media institutions. In sum, these matters all impact on existing policies and regulations for elections and for communications related to the internet. UNESCO's value of internet universality promotes an internet based on human rights, openness, and accessibility, and it's underpinned by multi-stakeholder participation known as the Rome Principles. This holistic and inclusive approach to internet governance draws in media, civil society, media regulation bodies, internet companies, governments, and others as stakeholders. Given the value of the internet for both reliable journalism and official communications, and for voters to be informed as well as act as watchdogs over processes, it is important to avoid the extreme step of cutting off internet access during elections. To protect the integrity of communications around an election, abuses and problems can be dealt with in proportionate and legal ways without disrupting connectivity as such. In conclusion, let me emphasize on behalf of the African Union and UNESCO that free, independent, and professional journalism, both online and offline, serves as an essential role in democracies. It provides information that allows citizens to make informed decisions inside and outside the voting booth. It holds the powerful to account for the integrity, peace, and fairness of an election. Journalism can also contribute to the electoral agenda by requiring politicians to respond to the public and to focus on the subjects of real public interest. These subjects include the SDGs, a common cause that is agreed by the global community, which range from advancing peace and human rights through to ensuring cultural diversity, gender equality, combating poverty, creating sustainable cities, and countering climate change. During times of conflict, journalism can be a beacon in a storm of information where unchecked lies are disseminated and emotions are whipped up to the detriment of a culture of peaceful conflict resolution. In reconciliation processes, conflict-sensitive journalism can play a pivotal role. It can bridge divides through accurate reporting, break down stereotypes, cover human stories, and present solutions. Such journalism can help prevent polarization, violence, and war. Yesterday, in Addis Ababa, the 2019 UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize was awarded to Reuters journalists Kiao Sao and Waloni, I hope I'm pronouncing their names right, following the recommendation of an international jury of media professionals. UNESCO has also launched a global media campaign called Defend Journalism to promote journalism that debunks falsehoods, uses verified sources, and counters disinformation. World Press Freedom Day is a major opportunity to advance the agenda of deepening democracy and sustainable development in digital times. I therefore call on you to share this message and promote the campaign on your social media with the hashtag that you see all over this room, World Press Freedom Day. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency, for that really powerful and detailed defense of the rights of journalists and the media and the role that they can play. Now let's turn to the practitioner. Our next speaker is Ms. Valeria Robecco from ANSA News Agency. She is president of the United Nations Correspondent Association. Ms. Robecco.
Abdullah Ananzai, Abdul Manan Argand, Abdul Rahman Ismail Yassin, Abdullah Al-Qadri, Abdullah Mire Ashi, Achyutananda Sau, Ahmed Abu Hussein, Ahmed Azize, Alexander Rastoguyev, Ali Salimi, Angel Eduardo Gaona, Awil Dair Salad, Bashar Al-Attar, Carlos Dominguez Rodriguez, Chandan Tiwari, Gerald Fishman, Ghazi Rasuli, Amaud Al-Jaid, Ibrahim Al-Munjar, Jairo Souza, Amal Khashoggi, Ian Kuchak, Jefferson Puriza Lopez, John McNamara, Juan Javier Ortega Reyes, Kamel Abu Al-Walid, Kirill Radchenko, Leobardo Vázquez Atzin, Leslie Ann Pamela Montenegro del Real, Mahram Durrani, Mario Leonel Gomez Sanchez, Mohammad Al-Qadasi, Mohammad Salim Angar, Musa Abdul Karim, Mustafa Salama, Naveen Nishal, Noroz Ali Rajabi, Obeida Abu Omar, Omar Ezi Mohammad, Orkan Zemal, Paul Rivas Bravo, Raed Fares, Ramiz Amadi, Rob Iasen, Sabaun Kakar, Salim Talash, Samim Faramarz, Sandeep Sharma, Shah Marai, Shuyat Bukhari, Sohail Khan, Wendy Winters, Iyar Muhammad Toki, Yaser Murtaya. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the colleagues I just mentioned are the journalists killed in 2018 according to Committee to Protect Journalists. There is no more time for words. We need actions. As president of the United Nations Correspondent Association, I would like to point out the two main issues that keep our profession between a rock and an hard place. Journalists are threatened, and the growing number of colleagues are killed. At the same time, we are threatened by the diffusion of fake news, which has not only diminished public trust, but also becomes a lever for autocratic regimes to attack and persecute us. According to the 2019 World Press Freedom Index, recently released by Reporters Without Borders, hostility towards journalists across the globe is growing. Authoritarian regimes continue to tighten their grip on media organizations, leading to an increase in hatred and fear haunting media workers. Furthermore, journalists in democratic and free nations are also under threat. Essentially, the climate that journalists work in has deteriorated worldwide, and journalism can be an extremely dangerous profession. Last November, the UN Secretary General underlined that in just over a decade, more than 1,000 reporters have been murdered or killed while on the job, and many more have been persecuted, arbitrarily arrested, intimidated, injured, or harassed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, freedom of speech, not only for the press, but for everyone, is not a gift. It is a human right that must be protected by governments. I echo past appeals by the Secretary General in calling for governments to protect journalists and to strengthen press freedom. But that's not all. Today, I ask the United Nations to make a step forward in addressing the protection of journalism and journalists all over the world by appointing a UN Special Representative for the protection of journalists. Today, UNCA feels more than ever its role as a link between politics and diplomacy that takes shape in their multifaceted relationship between the United Nations and journalism, and its function of communication between the work carried on throughout the UN and its agencies and the work of media that has been called upon to carry out the function of observer and arbiter of such activities. This function confronts not only the risk on the personal safety of journalists, but also the risk surrounding the reliability of information, of that which today is the phenomenon of fake news. The news media landscape has changed profoundly over the past decades. There has been a critical increase in the reach of journalism and social media throughout digital sources. But on the other hand, fake news is accelerating. The democratic tool that is internet has turned out to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it helps diffusion, but on the other hand, it encourages the creation of niche areas that not only disinform, but reinforce prejudices. The recent new civil war in Libya has shown day by day how conflicts can be conducted not only with weapons and soldiers, but also with disinformation and fake news. Furthermore, political contests today have been deeper contaminated by disinformation and misinformation. There is much more, such as the manipulation of social media and their use as a weapon of mass disinformation, of which ultimately authentic and transparent information becomes the victim itself. There is a risk that powerful actors are exploiting fake news to suppress the real media. In today's context of disinformation, the risk is in fact that people believe whatever content is supported by their social network. And this concerns first and foremost political elections. For these reasons, facing the dissemination of fake news is an imperative for journalism. And it is also an opportunity to prove the importance of new and traditional media and their ability to provide verifiable information in the public interest. This without disregarding the fact that to maintain an open and democratic system, it is important that governments, businesses, and consumers work together. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is the paradigm within which the debate on freedom and accuracy of information can no longer ignore a key figure such as a UN Special Representative for the Protection of Journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robecco, for bringing in that new call for a UN representative. Thank you. I would now like to call upon His Excellency Monsieur François Delattre, Permanent Representative of France and co-chair of the United Nations Member States Group of Friends on Protection of Journalists. Excellency.
Bonjour, mes chers amis.
Good morning, dear friends, Madam President, Madam USG, Your Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I have the pleasure to address you today on behalf of 21 member states of the United Nations Group of Friends for the Protection of Journalists, co-chaired by France, Greece, and Lithuania. It is therefore on behalf of those 21 member states that I would like to convey our warm gratitude to UNESCO and to the United Nations Department of Global Communications for organizing this event, this important event to mark the 26th World Press Freedom Day. This day is a reminder that freedom of expression, including, of course, for members of the independent media, is indispensable for good governance, informed decision-making, democracy, free and fair electoral processes, and the accountability of governments. Today, as we honor journalists imprisoned and killed in the line of duty, we also take stock of press freedom, as well as the safety and security of journalists around the world. And in that difficult context of which we're all aware and which was just recalled, it is more important than ever to recommit to the core principles of free, pluralistic, independent, and safe journalism and the protection of the media from all attacks on its independence. The international community, in fact, all of us are witness to the rising dangers to press freedom around the world through the combined effect of deteriorating security conditions and often increasingly repressive media climate and shrinking space for civil society. Growing volumes of disinformation and polarizing public discourse threaten peaceful elections and press freedom, as do fierce attacks that we have witnessed on factual reporting, both online and offline in traditional media. All of these phenomena contribute to the fall of public trust in established political systems and in news outlets. Disinformation, repression, harassment, and violence against journalists add new strains on human rights and fundamental freedoms. And in these difficult times, it is all the more essential for each and every one of us to defend freedom of expression in all its forms. Mindful of the challenges ahead and the scale of those challenges, the 21 members of the group of friends reaffirm our commitment to the protection of media and its potential to support democracy and peace. And we underscore its fundamental contribution to government accountability and the transparency of elections. The creation of the Group of Friends for the Protection of Journalists in 2016 was primarily driven by the shared sense of urgency of the founding member states to promote better implementation of existing international human rights law relating to the protection of journalists. We were and remain concerned that despite significant progress in international legal frameworks, major gaps remain, and the legal framework is moreover challenged by the reality that journalists and media workers face on a daily basis. These concerns are naturally shared by other governments, and we welcome the recent additions of Ghana and the UK to our group of friends. Today, the group remains more dedicated than ever to promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including through the implementation of resolutions on the protection of journalists, as well as the UN Plan of Action adopted under the auspices of UNESCO. We're particularly grateful for the leadership of the Secretary General in this regard, and for his activation of the relevant focal points network within the United Nations system. The group continues to work closely with UN entities, representatives of media organizations, of course, and non-governmental organizations. The member states of the Group of Friends remain firm in their long-standing commitment to independent media and to upholding their international obligations and commitments regarding freedom of expression. And in that context, in particular, the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, as well as in implementing national initiatives in this area and sharing good practices, ranging from strengthening national legal frameworks to multiple activities ensuring the safety of journalists and media workers. A free and independent media is the cornerstone of democratic governance. Among other things, it plays an essential role in identifying human rights violations and abuses and promoting accountability and combating impunity. We value greatly the contribution of all journalists who risk their freedom and lives to provide independent reporting, and we remain fully committed to supporting them in their vital mission. We extend our support, and I will conclude here, to the efforts of UNESCO and international and grassroots organizations to promote the protection of journalists, their rights and freedoms, and to all member states for promoting an environment in which journalists can carry out their work without fear of reprisal. We all know that what's at stake here is essential, so may the freedom of the press live. Thank you.
Merci bien.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your words in defense of the freedom of the press.
I thank everybody gathered here and watching live stream for participating this morning. I believe that Afghanistan has asked for the floor. If the representative of Afghanistan is here. Yes. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. First of all, we wish to thank UNESCO and the UN Department of Global Communications for organizing this important event on World Press Freedom Day, and the panelists also for the presentations. This event and many others taking place around the world is indeed a tribute to the efforts and sacrifices of journalists and media personnel in promoting democracy. As such, the media plays an important role in building a global landscape grounded in the rule of law. Afghanistan's democratic experience over the past 18 years is indeed a testament to the way in which the media helps consolidate democratic values and principles in society. The emergence of a vibrant media sector is among our main achievements since 2001. We have invested heavily on this issue, knowing full well that an independent media is vital to the long-term democratic development of our country. Afghanistan has held consecutive presidential and parliamentary elections since 2001, each of which has provided us the opportunity for our people to choose their future political destiny. In all elections, the media has been an important conduit between various democratic political forces, including candidates, political parties, civil society, and the people. The media has helped shape a healthy political discourse and also identify gaps that enable further improvements to the electoral processes, which further consolidates democracy. As we approach presidential elections this coming September, the media will continue to play its important role in ensuring that all candidates are able to be heard and that the outcome of the process reflects the will of the people. The role of the media is also essential in support of peace processes. The wide nexus of skilled and courageous Afghan journalists are among the key stakeholders involved in our peace efforts currently underway with the Taliban. The media is keeping the public aware of developments in the peace process and also helping highlight the views and demands of all Afghans on key issues in this regard, especially on preserving the democratic gains of the past 18 years. Having said that, attacks against journalists in Afghanistan regrettably continue as terrorist and extremist groups seek to undermine our democracy and the very visible progress in our free and independent media sector. Last week, we commemorated the first year anniversary of the 30 April 2018 attack, which killed 10 journalists who were on site covering a previous attack. The deliberate attack on the group of journalists marked a crime against humanity. More broadly, more than 50 journalists have been killed in Afghanistan over the past 5 years alone. The protection of journalists and enabling them to operate in a free environment is a core priority for our government. As such, impunity for crimes against journalists is deemed a violation of the core principles of our Constitution, our penal code, and other national legislation. Protection is also being advocated at the highest levels of government. Several presidential decrees have been issued calling for decisive action to investigate and prosecute all cases to ensure accountability for all crimes against journalists. Various institutions, including the security sector and the Attorney General's office, are taking decisive action on this issue. More concretely, we have, as of late, tried 54 cases of violence against journalists in our judicial institutions. Our protection measures also include the creation of a commission on access to information and a joint committee with the media to monitor cases of violence against journalists. We have also formed the Journalist Support Fund to make sure that the needs of the victims of crimes and their families are met. As we commemorate World Press Freedom Day, let us all strive to further empower and protect journalists and media personnel around the world as a priority for the benefit of democracy, peace, and development worldwide. Afghanistan remains a committed partner in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that powerful reminder of what sacrifices are being made in the name of the free press and free elections. Before concluding this first segment, I would like to thank UNESCO expressly for joining the Department of Global Communications in organizing this event. I now invite my friend and colleague, Mr. Maher Nasser, Director from the Outreach Division of the Department of Global Communications, and our distinguished speakers to the podium for the interactive segment of today's program. Thank you so very much for being with us this far. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to read the names. I should have.
Good morning. If I could ask you to take your seats, please. Thank you, Alison, for leading this morning's session. And good morning, everybody with us in the room. And this is the most I have seen this room full on the World Press Freedom Day. It's so great to see so many young faces from universities, and I hope that most of you are studying journalism, and this is a lot of food for thought for you. This is better than any lecture you will ever go to. My name is Maher Nasser. I'm the director of the Outreach Division in the UN Department of Global Communications, and I always take the honor in being part of coordinating this event with UNESCO, our partner in this. So this second segment will be an interactive part. We will have brief interventions from the panel, and then we'll turn it over to you. So we know that this event is also webcast live, so we'd like to thank all of our viewers and people who are watching, and we'd like to invite you in the room and those watching to engage in the conversation through using the hashtag World Press Freedom Day, one word, hashtag Press Freedom, and hashtag UN with civil society. And thanks to the Committee on Information, this event is being held within the framework of the Committee on Information, so we have interpretation to the in the 5 additional languages of the United Nations. So if you wish to benefit from that, just pick up the earpiece and choose the language that you want to listen to. And please feel free to do so. And if you want to ask your question or your intervention in a different language, just also do that. And then the interpretation, if it is one of the 5 other languages, the interpretation will be available. So it is my privilege today to welcome our distinguished panel of speakers, all of whom have diverse experience and expertise that ties in with the theme of this year's observance of World Press Freedom Day, journalism and elections. I invite you to view their biographies in your program, for those of you in the room, for more information on their inspiring careers. We will save time and not go into that in the presentations. You can have a look at that, and I think the program that is available online also has it for those of you watching the webcast. We are thrilled to have you with us on a panel and look forward to a fruitful and engaging discussion on our topic, Media for Democracy, Journalism and Elections in Times of Disinformation. And I think this morning we also heard shocking numbers from Ambassador Amal, who quoted some of the statistics. 348 journalists were detained in 2018. 80 were killed, and we heard their names thanks to Valerie, the president of UNCA. And 60 are held hostage. So these are grim times to be a journalist, I think, in the world. When we come to work, when we leave our home to do our job, we don't imagine that we would be killed for doing our job, or we would be detained for doing our job. But those numbers and those names were either detained or killed for doing their job, to be a journalist. Observing World Press Freedom Day is critical for the United Nations, and it is gaining more momentum around the world. And one example is this full room. It is our duty to ensure that the conversation is unremitting and includes all the voices, especially the youth. As I said before, I'm very happy to see so many young faces in the audience today. To all of you who are here today, welcome. We look forward to hearing your perspective on this issue and for you to engage with this panel later on this morning. A free, independent, and pluralistic media is fundamental to ensuring good governance. Today, there's an influx of information that is made available, which is easier to access and often drafted with little regard to journalistic values and guidelines. This has further led to increasingly polarized discussions, which in turn has cultivated a hate-spewing, misogynistic, and altered version of news, which is being consumed by an alarmingly large number of people around the world, causing for a spread of inconsistent views on press freedom. In the face of these challenges, the focus must be repositioned to protecting press freedom and all those working towards bringing free information to us, while keeping in mind the changing landscape within the field of media and the steadily decreasing attention span of consumers. There will be much to discuss here in the room, as well as virtually. So again, a reminder, please use the hashtags World Press Freedom Day, hashtag Press Freedom, hashtag UN with Civil Society to be part of the conversation. At this juncture, I would like to thank our United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, again, for partnering with us and for being an ever-faithful, long-term partner in this endeavor. I now have the pleasure to introduce Ms. Meredith Broussard, Associate Director, Arthur Carter Journalism Center, New York University. Meredith, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor.
Let me just turn this on.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank UNESCO and also the UN Department of Global Communications for this invitation to be here today. It's quite an honor. So I am a professor of data journalism, which is the practice of finding stories in numbers and using numbers to tell stories. And I have a new book out called Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about artificial intelligence and journalism and how this impacts press freedom and democracy. So I build artificial intelligence tools for investigative reporting. And I invented a kind of tool that I call the Story Discovery Engine that allows investigative reporters to quickly and efficiently uncover new story ideas in public affairs data. And I was doing a demonstration of this system one day at a kind of science fair. And next to me, presenting next to me, was an undergraduate who had done a data visualization. And so we got to chatting, and he said, "Oh, you do AI?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Did you build an AI system?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, where is it?" And I said, "Here." And my laptop was sitting on the table. And he kind of starts looking at the laptop, and then he starts looking underneath as if he was looking for a little brain. And I realized that he thought by artificial intelligence, I meant that there was something sentient inside the computer. I realized that he thought that I meant there was a little kind of biological brain inside the laptop, and that something magical and beyond human understanding had been rendered incarnate. And I think about this, I kind of explained, I should say, that no, it's a computer program, because that's what artificial intelligence is. It's a computer program. But I've realized that this kind of misconception about what artificial intelligence is gets in the way of societies being able to make good decisions about what we can and should do with artificial intelligence. So the definition that I always start with is that artificial intelligence is a subfield of computer science, the same way that algebra is a subfield of mathematics. And inside AI, there are lots of different subfields. There's machine learning, there's expert systems, there's natural language processing. But machine learning is the one that's really popular right now. And so there's been this linguistic confusion that happens. where when people say, oh, I'm using artificial intelligence for business, what they really mean is machine learning for business, which again sounds like machine learning, it sounds like the computer is sentient, but it's not. Machine learning is just math. It's computational statistics. So one of the things that I'm really committed to is I'm committed to better technology education inside journalism as a way of empowering journalists to call nonsense when tech companies are making claims like, oh, we've invented an artificial intelligence that is going to be totally revolutionary. Because yes, there are so many wonderful revolutionary possibilities with technology, but we really need to not get carried away and not imagine that the machine is more powerful than it actually is. And the notion that machines are somehow more objective or more unbiased than humans is part of a kind of bias that I write about in my book, and I call it techno-chauvinism. The idea that technology is superior to humans. And this kind of bias, this techno-chauvinism, is something that has become really popular in the past couple of decades. And we say things like, oh, it's not really fair to have humans decide where somebody should go to school. We should use a computer because it'll be more objective or unbiased. Or, oh, if we use a computer program to give somebody a risk score that evaluates whether or not they're likely to commit another crime after they've been arrested, well, that's going to be better than having a judge make that decision. And so these incidents of techno-chauvinism are a kind of bias, and I would urge everyone to push back against techno-chauvinism, to critique the idea that technology is better than humans. Instead, I would argue that it's really about what is the right tool for the task. Because sometimes, absolutely yes, a computer is the right tool for the task, and other times, the right tool for the task is, say, a book in the hands of a child sitting on its parent's lap. And one is not superior to another. So where does this intersect with journalism? Techno-chauvinism comes into play when we think about journalism and social media and freedom. Because the social media companies have given us this notion that somehow, because they're using algorithms to sort through content, it is somehow superior to human judgment. And that someday there's going to be this grand world where the machines are going to autonomously determine what is good content and what is bad content, and the social media platforms are going to work completely without human intervention. And what I would suggest is that we've tried this, and it hasn't worked. So what if we start thinking about the online world not as something special and different where the regular rules don't apply? What if we start thinking about the online world as the same as the real world? Right? Techno-chauvinists have given us this idea that cyberspace is somehow different. And we tried it for a long time, and it's not working particularly well. The experience of journalists online is an experience of harassment. Journalism is being undermined. Journalists themselves are being attacked. Especially women journalists are being harassed at an absolutely unprecedented scale. So female journalists who I know generally get a lot of obscene photos in their email and in their DMs every single day. It is just like an unrelenting stream of filth. And this would not be permissible in the real world. So why are we permitting it online? So we can critique the notion that online is different and special. We can critique this techno-chauvinist notion. And we can use this critique in order to preserve journalistic freedom online, in order to combat misinformation, online, in order to ensure the sanctity of our elections online, as well as in the real world. So this is obviously closely linked to understanding more about artificial intelligence, because we need to empower ourselves around artificial intelligence so we don't feel like artificial intelligence is something that we can't understand and we don't have control over. And so we don't feel like technology is something that has to happen to us. AI offers many wonderful opportunities to create and connect. And let's also make sure that we're designing a world in which we protect the media, we protect press freedom, and we protect civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Broussard, and I think it was a healthy reminder that artificial intelligence that reinforces biases and hatred isn't intelligent.
Exactly.
I think whatever you feed into the machine is what you will get. Big data is, so far, it reflects the world that historically existed before you feed it into the machine, and since most of it is biased, then if you ask the machine and trust the machine to just spew out results from what data and project into the future, it will project those biases. And I think this is the important salient point, not just in journalism, but in everything that we apply to artificial intelligence and big data analysis. So thank you for that intervention. So our next speaker is Mr. Stephen Adler, Editor-in-Chief, Reuters. And as you have heard this morning, 2 Reuters journalists were awarded this year's Guillermo Cano Press Freedom Prize, Kaya So'o and Wa Lane, Reuters journalists from Myanmar. Stephen, thank you for being with us, and it's my pleasure to invite you to take the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, and it's great to see so many people here today. I will start, as I always will, until they're out of prison, with Wa Lone and Josso U. They woke up for the 508th morning this morning in prison in Yangon, in a place called Insane Prison. And they are there for doing just what we as journalists are supposed to do, reporting factually and accurately and fairly about something that really matters in the world. And as you may know, they were reporting on the massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. They had, it's a piece of technology, they had access to photographs. They were given photographs so that they could actually see physically that 10 young men and boys between 17 and 45 were lined up. We have a picture of them kneeling, and then we have a picture of them hacked to death and shot to death in a grave. So they were arrested and interrogated specifically about that reporting, and they were convicted under the Official Secrets Act, and they've been in prison ever since, and we are fighting for their freedom every single day. And we appreciate the work of the UN in helping with that fight. So what does that have to do with technology, and what does it have to do with social media? Social media in Myanmar is the internet. About 20 million people are on Facebook out of a population of 53 million people. It is the main tool of the government in disseminating information or misinformation, and it is the main way that hate speech and bad feelings about Rohingya Muslims, about the minority there, are disseminated, and also a place where a tremendous amount of anti-press sentiment is expressed. Reuters did an investigation of Facebook's activity in Myanmar, and even after Facebook had said it was monitoring it and trying to take down hate speech, we found 1,000 instances of hate speech, mostly against the Rohingya Muslims, on Facebook in Myanmar. So you really have to ask the question of the role that social media is playing in terms of free press. It's a really tough question for me and for everybody who cares about press freedom, because on the one hand, if you're in the US and you're a First Amendment absolutist, if you're a believer in free press, you don't want to see censorship of social media, you don't want to see censorship of information. On the other hand, around the world, it has been captured in many cases by people who are passing off misinformation. and it's become probably the biggest disseminator of misinformation in the world. There isn't a clear answer yet. Nobody really has come up with a really good approach. I'm very resistant to government regulation. Self-regulation so far has been insufficient. But I come around to something that I think is really the only thing that's going to make a difference going forward in the ability of people to really understand what's factual and what isn't. And that's media literacy and media literacy education. It strikes me that we in the media can fact check ourselves, and we can fact check each other, and we can ride herd on social media companies, and people can propose one idea or another as to how to regulate or restrict what happens on social media. But ultimately, technology is unleashing an enormous amount of information. In many senses, that's good. If you're a researcher, it's, the internet and social media are tremendous sources of good information. If you're just trying to find out what's going on in the world and you're sophisticated, you're one of the elites or you're a sophisticated news user, social media can be of enormous value. But if you're less sophisticated, you're being fed misinformation that you do not have the tools to sort. And we think that it's perfectly natural and appropriate that young people should learn coding, they should learn about technology, but we're not training them in how to actually determine what's factual and what's fake, how to look at a website, how to look at a posting, and look at the indicia of whether something is likely to be accurate or likely not to be. There's some very good trainings going on there. There are people who are really focused on this, and it's incredibly important. But it's viewed as kind of an afterthought. It's something that is generally not top of mind in the debate about social media. But if every intermediate school and upper school, if kids were learning about this even from earlier ages everywhere in the world, then they would have the tools to figure out what's accurate and what isn't. And then you could have a much freer flow of information because people would know what to do with it. So that's certainly true in Myanmar, that's true in the United States, that's true everywhere in the world. So I would really encourage that people pay more attention to that issue and focus more on it. I guess my only final point will be that sometimes people think of the news media as something very distinct. And actually, I think of the news media as one of the ways that information is disseminated in the world. What news is really just a subset of the broader category of information. And when you think about how to talk about why news is useful, yes, it's partly about how reporters show that there's bad things going on in the world and how they expose wrongdoing, but it's also about how on a day-to-day basis, what journalists do is help people make smart decisions. If you're in the financial field, you don't care about somebody's opinion, you care about getting actual factual information about what's happening so you can make smart investment decisions. If you're in the business community, you need to know about trade, you need to know about your competitors, you need to know about the economy in your country and other countries so that you can make smart business decisions. And if you're an individual, think about how people use the news media. They're looking up things about insurance, about neighborhoods, about mortgages, about investments, about laws and safety, so they can figure out how to live their lives. And they're looking at what the political environment looks like so they can make smart political decisions. And if we think about it that way, it's not as threatening. It's that if you get good information, you can make good decisions. Everybody understands that. And I think we in the media are essentially the intermediary that help people get good information so they can make good decisions. And they're only going to know if it's good information or not if they have some media literacy skills. So I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. And I think your point on media literacy is key. What we have seen is with the explosion of access to information and ability to replicate and share information has sort of like watered down the mark where people can judge this is factual or this is an opinion or this is false. And sharing it so far, it doesn't even require you to go and photograph something and make copies and post them or distribute them. You just have to click. And with a click, you can share something that is full of hatred, that we have seen the ramifications of that in Myanmar. And we have seen the ramifications of attacks on houses of worship, like mosques in New Zealand and in other places, synagogues and churches. It's all something that has motivated the Secretary General now to create a special strategy to how can we in the UN system combat hate speech. and how it is being disseminated through social media and other tools. So now we'd like to introduce Ms. Alex Tarqueño, President, Society of Professional Journalists. We thank you for joining us in the panel today, and I think Society of Professional Journalists is something that we need to remind ourselves. There is something called professional journalism. It's a profession. It's not anybody who has a platform that writes whatever they want is a journalist. So, please.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Mayor. And I'd also like to extend my special thanks to Ricardo of UNESCO for inviting me. And this is an awesome privilege to represent my organization, the Society of Professional Journalists, here at the United Nations. It's also an honor to speak alongside such esteemed journalists. I had to pinch myself on the way up onto the stage to make sure I wasn't dreaming that I was speaking between Stephen Adler and Warren Hogue. And I also want to thank UNESCO for weaving together these issues of press freedom and electoral integrity. I think that's a really important and timely combination this year. Although this is a global event addressing the challenges of disinformation and those that it poses to core democratic values of press freedom and electoral transparency, an issue that we've seen again and again from Brazil to India, it strikes me as appropriate that we're meeting today here in New York because the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, which concluded with an all-New York finale, really was a wake-up call. And it put the institutions that defend democracies around the world on high alert. To be sure, worldwide, there were already plenty of electoral threats, both unintentional from flawed ballots like we saw in Florida in 2000 to outright forms of coercion. And likewise, there's been plenty of disinformation, particularly along the campaign trails. Not a few politicians over the years have repeated half-truths or falsehoods in the hope that, you know, by the time they win the election, their deceptions will not have been debunked. But in 2016, we woke up to the reality that freedom of expression itself had been weaponized. The enemies of strong democratic values had essentially learned a new trick. They had turned the power of self-expression on social media platforms, which only 5 years earlier had given us so much hope as they unleashed the natural desire for self-determination in the Arab Spring, into a cloaking device, allowing them to wage a surreptitious influence campaign. Social media bots generated by troll farms, deceptive political banner ads, and spear-phishing computer hacks, coupled with selective leaks, these became low-cost, high-yield disinformation tools requiring little in the way of technological know-how. Over the last 2 years, the platforms have employed internal checks. They've tried automated algorithms alongside small armies of human content moderators to try and combat the malicious trolls, spreading deliberate disinformation. However, we know very little about these defensive measures because the platforms are controlled by private companies. So they're not subject to the strictures of public entities. They don't need to obey the same guidelines of transparency and accountability to the public. The organization that I represent, the Society of Professional Journalists, held a summit last weekend to discuss these issues. In particular, this synergy between anti-democratic forces and digital disinformation. And more than 30 press freedom groups convened here in New York to hear experts in cybersecurity and digital disinformation. And they dissected, for example, what happened in 2016, much of which has now been verified by the Mueller report. And more terrifyingly, they discussed what might occur in the future as the opponents of democracy become more sophisticated. For example, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, described how hackers might, in the future, break into electoral systems to alter voting rolls. And they could do this in such a subtle way that people may not even realize why they're being turned away from the polls. And she pointed to a line in the Mueller report, which has since been discussed in the media, that there may have been a breach in the Florida electoral system. So Of course, this scenario involves a much higher degree of sophistication than internet trolling and goes beyond what reporters can correct in real time with the important fact-checking efforts that we put in place. Government agencies and cybersecurity consultants need to look into that. But henceforward, journalists covering elections will need to be more vigilant and particularly more tech-savvy in order to understand these threats and to be able to observe potential threats as they occur, as the voting process plays out. Deliberate disinformation, on the other hand, whether spread by state or non-state actors, may have an even more insidious purpose. Rather than simply affecting the elections, it actually undermines our confidence in democracies. And this point, this was pointed out at our panel last weekend by Laura Rosenberger, who's now with GMF's Alliance for Securing Democracy, but she was with Hillary Clinton's campaign. And she pointed out that when the trolls began to operate, there was no front-runner Republican candidate. The real goal, she said, was just simply undermining the faith in democracy. So at this time, we're being asked to put our faith in algorithms to solve this problem. These same algorithms, however, failed to block 1 in 5 videos of the mosque attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand in March. And the numbers are staggering. Users tried to upload 1.5 million videos after the shooter live-streamed his attack. And although most were blocked, some 300,000 got through before they were removed. So they evaded that cybersecurity net. Another serious concern is the increasing sophistication of so-called deepfakes, which are digital audio, video, and still images that are hyper-realistic forgeries that increasingly blur the lines between fact and fiction. And this battle against disinformation and deepfakes is likely to rage on for some time, as each defensive measure is countered by new technological advances on the other side. So in this way, it's akin to an arms race like those that we're already familiar with. Now, as someone who represents other journalists, I ask what measures journalists can take to effectively counter this disinformation. Firstly, more than a dozen of the press groups that gathered for last weekend's summit drafted a resolution to reaffirm our role as watchdogs. And this may sound an obvious statement on World Press Freedom Day, but we must recommit ourselves to presenting the public with the factual information that it needs to make sound decisions on vital questions, to include electoral decisions. And we issued that statement today in honor of World Press Freedom Day. You can find it on our website, spj.org, and we're also, of course, spreading it on our social media. However, in order for citizens to be well-informed, journalists must be free to do their jobs without fear of reprisal, intimidation, or threat of physical harm. And that's a tall order. We were honored last weekend to have Maria Ressa at our summit, where she eloquently advocated for the rights of a free press before leaving for the Philippines, for Duterte, and for her destiny. She reminded the room full of journalists who are relatively safe within the U.S. That staying free sometimes takes genuine courage. Secondly, our summit resolution encourages journalists to invite the public to become our allies in this fight. We urge the public to help journalists correct mistakes and counter misinformation they find online, whether that information appears to be malicious or simply mistaken. And finally, we should hold all governments and private platforms to account, pushing them to develop the technological and regulatory solutions that we need to counter this disinformation, but at the same time making sure their actions are transparent and they remain engaged with the public as they do so. Together, we must tackle this threat to our democracies proactively and with the optimism that we can preserve our dearly won freedoms. Journalists here in the United States can be encouraged that Congress members recently submitted a resolution expressing their sense of this, and they quote, the importance of local print and digital journalism to the continued welfare, transparency, and prosperity of the government at every level, and to the continuation of the freedom of the United States as we know it. This is a global problem, and U.S. Congress members have introduced several bills recognizing that. For example, the Global Electoral Exchange Act would promote the exchange of electoral best practices internationally, particularly in the areas of cybersecurity and data transmission. In conclusion, Democracies have collectively tackled worse foes. Arguably, the democratic world faced far greater threats from fascism in the 1930s and 40s, and out of that conflict emerged multilateral institutions like the UN and high moral standards such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This challenge may require similar collaborative effort to stand against the forces of disinformation. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Kenyo, for these important remarks. It reminds me of Secretary General Antonio Guterres in his first speech to the General Assembly in September 2017 spoke about the 7 challenges and threats that we face. And number 6 of those was the dark side of innovation. We have all benefited from the 4th industrial revolution. We are better connected. At the same time, now we see certain aspects that are still unregulated, that are still interfering and leading to increased lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in media, lack of trust in governments. And how do we get around this side of it? And I think you have mentioned something about regulatory need for that. And I think maybe we can explore this issue more in terms of in the discussion. So now I'm pleased to turn to my last speaker on the panel, friend and colleague Warren Hogue, Senior Advisor for External Relations at International Peace Institute, former editor and foreign correspondent at the New York Times. And actually we first met when he was still with the New York Times, and it was a trip for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to the Middle East. I was based in Cairo at the time, and we got to know each other in Beirut and Cairo. So thank you, Warren. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maher. I also, like you, Alex, am indebted to our friend Ricardo Guimarães Pinto for the idea of what I would talk about. Ricardo said maybe I would talk about the potential to promote a culture of sustainable peace and democracy that the media has. Now, to PEN America, which is a literature and human rights organization, that potential comes from, 1, uncovering stories that expose injustice and corruption. It comes from, 2, fostering knowledge of how peace can be consolidated and expanded. And it comes from, 3, cultivating space for dialogue. Now, as Ambassador Mudalali said in a previous meeting here just before this one, the Washington Post said it succinctly with its slogan, created 2 years ago, that now appears online and in every issue of the paper. That slogan is, "Democracy dies in darkness." In television and print ads that followed up that, it proclaimed in equally economical language, "Knowing empowers us. Knowing keeps us free. Knowing helps us to decide." Some critics have called those phrases naive, self-serving, heavy-handed, and defensive. But unfortunately, this is the pass we have come to. Casting light on the truth is something we have to proclaim as an essential element in how we organize society in a sustainably peaceful manner. Now, those would have been generally agreed upon notions when I began my newspaper career decades ago. But today we have to defend them because, as the Department of Global Communications and UNESCO program notes correctly point out, quote, "The contribution of free, pluralistic, independent, and safe journalism to democracy is under unprecedented stress. Polarizing political discourse has swept aside dispassionate, fact-based journalism." Now, I was having a conversation with an old New York Times colleague recently, and I used that phrase, fact-based journalism, and he laughed and he said, "Is there some other kind?" That's what we have come to. We find ourselves on the defensive. Somehow the argument has become not just how to project, influence, and maybe even inspire our traditional purposes, but how to defend and how to protect. In that connection, I note that one of the global media campaign materials being circulated, quite rightly, is called Defend Journalism, and the first subsection is labeled Debunk Falsehoods. Another is about protecting journalists, and I'm particularly glad to see that. You've heard the numbers at this session and the previous one, the extraordinary number of journalists who have been killed. Valeria Robecco, who is the head of the United Nations Correspondents Association, very movingly read off the names of the journalists who've been killed in the past year. I'm particularly glad to see that because I covered the guerrilla wars in Central America in the 1980s. It was very dangerous, and I had many friends and colleagues killed in firefights and by landmines. I once wrote a story for the front page of the New York Times about 4 of them, members of a Dutch television crew who were ambushed by army troops and had their bodies mutilated as a message to the rest of us who were continually being threatened with death if we didn't leave El Salvador. We also would be periodically approached by journalism advocates and asked if we needed protection, offers we of course welcomed, but in fact it was the local reporters and local photographers who were being killed in far larger numbers, and they had no ad hoc committees representing them, and no front page stories appeared in the world press about their killings. As for the priority given to debunking falsehoods, we are discovering, as many people have noted today here, in this period of alternative facts and organized disinformation and accusations of fake news and repetition of fully debunked claims that freedom of the press is something that must be defended, that must be put forward as something the public should realize is essential to sustaining peace. What does this have to do with democracy? Yale historian Timothy Snyder, an author of the book The Road to Unfreedom, says simply, post-truth is pre-fascism. After President Trump revived the 1930s Stalinist show trial charge of enemy of the people to describe the American press, the publisher of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, went to the White House and talked to the president in the Oval Office, and to his face warned him that tyrants and dictators around the world were using his incendiary words to threaten and silence reporters in their own societies. Unfortunately, disparagement of the media works. As President Trump told Leslie Stahl of CBS in an interview, quote, "If I discredit you, people won't believe you." It undermines our credibility, thereby destroying the most validating way we can contribute to the culture of sustainable peace and democracy. The issue now is not so much getting the media to publish positive stories about peace. It is about stopping the reckless press and organs of social media from publishing falsehoods, from inciting, from misrepresenting, from trolling people, all of which militate against sustaining peace. That said, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with their universality and with their impact on the individual lives of everyday people, offer the UN and the public a real opportunity to connect, and the media with a chance to be the ones to make that connection. Much as I admire the kind of journalism you find on websites like peacenews.net that promote the idea of calling attention to things that work, things that support the goal of sustaining peace, there's an inherent difficulty there for most journalists who see their role as being skeptical rather than accepting of claims of success. I faced this myself when I covered the United Nations for the New York Times. And people here kept saying, why don't you focus more on the good things that the UN does? Part of the answer is transactional. I had to call the office every day, as my colleagues had to, and persuade an editor that my story was more attention-getting and deserving of space in the paper than a competing one being offered by a colleague somewhere else in the world. One of those editors, by the way, was now Undersecretary General Alison Smale, who, when she was editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris, and I was the paper's correspondent in London, she was the one I had to call to try to convince the paper to publish my story. Of course, the editor is reacting to what she thinks the public wants. And a lot of people mulling this problem these days think the mission should not be just educating the journalist, but educating the reader or viewer as to what they ought to be interested in. Stephen Adler talked about this when he talked about the need for media literacy. The problem isn't just unreliable stories, the thinking goes, it is the public's willingness to believe anything that paints the other side in a bad light. Truth, sadly, is no longer a defense. But in the end, it must be. Many of those at high levels see truth as the threat. And you always have leaders propagating alternate realities. That should empower the media. When we tolerate dishonesty, we will get criminality, corruption, and abuse of power, all of which stand directly in the way of sustaining peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. And fact-based journalism is something that must become reality. As we also say in the UN, we want a rules-based world, because if we all have rules that we agree to, and these are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and now an ambitious agenda, thank you for actually being the first to mention the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. It's usually a UN colleague who does that, but thank you for that. So we have one discussant from Committee to Protect Journalists promoting freedom of the press and freedom of expression joining us from the floor, and we're grateful for your participation at the panel, this panel for discussion. Ms. Maria Salazar Ferro, Committee to Protect Journalists, who will present the recently issued Covering Elections Journalists Safety Kit, and then we will go to the discussion after that. So Maria, please have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great panel, and you guys have been talking about an issue that we at the Committee to Protect Journalists have been very much focused on this year. Among the real and very different conversations around the challenges of covering elections, to us, none is more real than the safety, the real safety of those reporting the news on the ground, because indeed, there has never been a more dangerous time to be a journalist around the world. As head of CPJ's Emergencies Department, I oversee our safety work. On a daily basis, we give journalists, reporters, photographers, editors, life-saving, up-to-date information on how to stay safe. And when that's not enough, we step in and provide them with emergency assistance. This year, CPJ's emergencies team is focused on covering elections and on helping journalists to stay safe while doing so. For this, we developed a journalist safety toolkit, which includes information both for journalists and for editors on how to stay safe. The idea of including editors here is because we're trying to promote a culture of safety, and I like that Warren, you brought this up, in which both the reporters on the ground and the editors that they're working with are aware of the issues and are working on how to solve them. To develop these toolkits, we have been working with our regional experts, but have also had extensive conversations with journalists in countries that had elections scheduled this year. And in those conversations, we identified 3 countries where we really honed in, those being South Africa, India, and Guatemala. And for each of these countries, we developed a specific toolkit that goes alongside our general toolkit. The toolkit that we developed focused on 2 issues that we found of most concern. In addition to the continuous physical attacks that journalists are facing every day while reporting on rallies or other political gatherings, we were really struck by the need for more digital safety information. When having conversations with journalists on a daily basis, I'm personally shocked of the lack of digital safety literacy that they have, the lack of access that they have to tools to protect themselves online. The digital risks that they're facing can range from having their phones stolen, and if the phone is not properly protected, they compromise their information, they compromise their sources, and they compromise themselves. But we're also looking at journalists, Meredith, as you were discussing, who are facing continuous online harassment, and thus the information that we're trying to provide them helps them to mitigate this risk and to protect against those dangers. So for the 3 countries that we identified, we have had people deployed to these countries. We've had our safety specialists working with journalists, with newsrooms, and with community journalists in South Africa. We are doing one-on-one safety consultations with journalists who are reporting in these countries. And in India, we had a correspondent go around the country to talk to journalists covering the elections about how to stay safe. For the rest of the year, we're going to continue to monitor elections as they come up. We're focusing, of course, in the Philippines. We're looking at Mozambique. We're looking at Tunisia. But really, there are a lot of elections going on this year. And we will continue to promote the toolkit and ask that you help us in promoting this toolkit as well. We will be, again, hosting one-on-one consultations and invite journalists to reach out to let us know what they're concerned about so that we can provide them with the support. To learn more about the toolkit, we invite you to visit the CPJ website, where we also have continuous safety information and tools for journalists for different issues, not only elections. For instance, right now we have a new safety advisory on covering the political crisis in Venezuela, so we invite you to come on, check it out, but also follow the hashtag CPJ Emergencies for ongoing information on election coverage, but generally on safety information for journalists. Thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Maria. And at this stage, we would like to open the floor for interventions, questions from the floor. Please try to be brief. Introduce yourself. Push the button. When you see it red, you can speak. And we'll try to take as many as possible, and then we'll turn to the panel for questions. And I'd like to ask my colleagues in the department if there are any questions or coming up from social media using the hashtag. Please bring them to me, and we will also take some from the world watching us. So I see one hand here. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mahanasa, as well as honorable distinguished panel. I'm George Anthony from Pathways to Peace and Amada Day Prep Global Institute. And one thing that kept coming up today was that hate rhetoric, such as enemy of the people, is specifically designed to condition the masses to distrust the role of media and journalism to such a point that we know the historical subtext. We heard that's a historical subtext when Honorable Representative Robecco read out those names. There is a price to pay. So journalism has always played a role in speaking for those voices who are silent. My question is, how do we address and alarm the incoming generation, as you see behind me, sitting behind me, that journalism is the foundation for a democracy to thrive? So my point is, we know that hate rhetoric is used to condition, but how do we at the same time condition a younger generation coming up to be alert to such subtext behind that type of rhetoric.
Thank you. James?
James Bays. James Bays from Al Jazeera. I do the same job at Al Jazeera, normally done by my colleague from Al Jazeera Arabic, Mahmoud Hussein, but for the last 862 days, he's not done that job. He's been in a Cairo jail. He's not been charged. He's not had a trial. He's not had a conviction. My question is about the lofty words that we've heard today about journalists and their work and elections. And I'd like the panel then to compare those words with a real-world example from this year, perhaps the election that the UN had the most stake in, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, because of all the peacekeepers there. And yet it's an election that journalists and election observers proved was completely stolen. And yet the African Union, the UN Security Council, UNESCO, and the UN Security Council completely ignored that and put perceived stability above democracy.
Thank you. Panel, would you like to comment? Any of the panel members would like to? Yes, please.
I think a couple of comments that perhaps address both of these concerns. We're not always going to be influential when we do good objective journalism. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing good objective journalism, and I think we shouldn't get discouraged when the impact is not what we hope it to be, because I think over time, throughout history, you've seen that that good, strong journalism done over time has had positive effects. But the real point I want to make is I think journalists are making a mistake when they politicize their defense of themselves or of their roles. I think that it has been a mistake for journalists to be as combative directly and to be perceived as either so pro-Trump or anti-Trump or pro any one government or anti any one government. I think we need to maintain in our defense of ourselves and in all of our work the idea that there are positive benefits to doing journalism, and that it's not about who you're for or who you're against. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, whose board I'm on, did a study that showed that support for press freedom messages in the U.S. goes down substantially when it's specifically linked to President Trump, and is much better received when it focuses on the positive benefits of journalism to the world. So in both of these instances, I think that we should be doing is focusing on what we do, why it matters, what standards we need to maintain, and try not to take sides. Because when we take sides, just from a practical matter, we're not as effective as when we stand up for the positive benefits of doing the kind of journalism we know we're supposed to do.
Yes, I don't know if I can tie the two questions together, but I have some thoughts on both. And beginning with the second one, first of all, I can't comment on the DCR. I think we'll leave that up to the UN and the African Union as to what came after the election. I will say that journalists take risks, and the point has been made several times today that local journalists take greater risks than foreign correspondents by far. Now, there may be more impact in the wider world when a journalist like Warren goes in and publishes a story in the New York Times, but the local journalists have an impact, particularly on local elections. And I have to admit that when Valeria, our colleague with the UN Correspondents Association, began speaking, I actually thought for the first few seconds that she was speaking in a foreign language, and I started to grab for this device. And then I realized that it was a list of names. I recognized enough names, but the names, well, the names are foreign to an Anglophone like me. Most of them are, in fact, local journalists, many of them probably in the Middle East, who have been killed. And that's why it sounded like a foreign language. So I think we have to really recognize that the journalists most at risk are not necessarily the famous correspondents for the New York Times, but they are local, and they need, I don't know, we need to support them, the international institutions, or the international community. Now, the first question is interesting because I think this this is a bit of a conundrum, particularly for those of us in the US who are big free speech absolutists, because I do now believe that we need to do things like block the Christchurch video before they go viral. However, it still makes me uncomfortable, and I'm dating myself here, but I did my master's in journalism in the late 90s when the internet was still a new thing, sort of internet 1.0. And I actually did my master's looking at hate groups on the internet. It was something we were talking about then, and it was something groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Anti-Defamation League were coming at from different points of view. But we were talking about this from the very beginning of the internet. It's not new. The difference is, at that time, the opinion I remember hearing a lot was that these are fringe opinions, and they will remain fringe online the same way they are fringe in the real world. They won't be talked about that much. The difference now with the social media platforms is that they amplify the most extreme views. So it is, in fact, the most extreme views that are shared by probably, I would presume, the smallest percentage of the people that become amplified and shared the most online. And I think that's what we fix. And if we fix the algorithms so they actually are not amplifying the views that are shared by very few people, to me, that's not a repression of free speech. That's just actually getting back to more the way that normal public discourse takes place in the non-virtual world.
I just wanted to make one comment, particularly with the young people in the room, and also from the aspect, I'm far and away the oldest person on this panel. I mentioned in my remarks decades ago when I began my journalism career, I left out how many decades. It was 5 decades ago. And the reason I mention that is what's been lost, and it's come out in some of the comments here, is the value and the power of impartiality. And now, in the newsrooms of my youth, I didn't know the political views of the different reporters. And I don't think that's true anymore. It certainly isn't true when you get into cable television. And to the extent that the news is being delivered with an attitude and with a prejudgment, the credibility goes down. And we see it in polls all the time, that people simply don't believe what they're hearing. I don't know, and I'm particularly addressing this to young people right now, if we can ever get back to that kind of impartiality. The word objectivity is now disdained, but it was the word that governed what we thought we were doing 40 and 50 years ago in American journalism. It's a plea, and I'm glad somebody suggested, and James from the floor, you sort of suggested it too, that if you are approaching the news with an attitude, if you are trying to make something positive or negative, whatever you write, whatever you broadcast is going to be much less believable than if you were perceived as a completely impartial speaker or writer. And that's the way the media, I think, can get back its influence and its power if it can somehow return to the days of being as impartial as possible. That way, credibility lies.
So I was about to make a joke about being the youngest person on the panel and asserting the privilege of talking about technology. But I realized that part of the problem is that we associate technology and youth, whereas really we should be associating technology and everybody. We should be thinking about it as an intergenerational phenomenon. And I want to talk about technology anyway, though, because I'm really interested in it, in the context of rhetoric. So you asked, how can we protect against rhetoric online? And I think that the answer is we can get more familiar with propaganda methods and how propaganda methods are amplified online and how strategic communicators are aware of propaganda methods and are using online tools in order to amplify their messages. So a slogan like the one you mentioned that disparages journalists, that has come up a number of times, that slogan is designed to be amplified. It's designed to be catchy. And so one of the ways that we can undermine its power is by not using it, not repeating it. Because every time you repeat it, you give it power. And every time you repeat it as a journalist, people perceive it as being amplified because they see it in the paper or on the website. And when it gets repeated on social media, it gets amplified. So we can change the words that we use. We can not amplify the propagandist's messages specifically. And then we can also use techniques like many media organizations used in the case of the Christchurch shooting. And when we have a mass shooting, we can not use the shooter's name because we know that shooters kind of hang out in these online communities and they valorize people who have committed these horrific acts. And then folks get incentivized to themselves perform some horrific act because they imagine that their names are going to be valorized in the same way that previous ones have. So we can be aware that that mechanism is at work, and we can disrupt that mechanism by not using the shooter's name, by not giving them what they think is credit.
Thank you for that. And I think that's why the Prime Minister of New Zealand refused to use the name of the shooter in that horrendous attack. Yeah. And Warren spoke about impartiality, and I think impartiality is one of the key assets the United Nations has that enables us to do what it does when it intervenes in conflicts. And that impartiality, sometimes advocacy, and the Secretary General uses that tool, advocacy, sometimes in public and sometimes in private. And it depends on the situation, but the goal is the same. You have to try to make the difference, whether it's the case of a detained journalist, whether it's public or in private. Advocacy is taking place, and the Secretary General has and will continue to do so. More questions? I see more hands coming up from the young people in the back. That's fantastic. We'll start with the lady there. Yes, you are. Please. The microphone is not on yet. Can you wait until it's read?
Thank you to Mr. Warren for highlighting the work of journalists in Central America. I wanted to take this time to honor the work of Lucia Pineda and Miguel Mora, two Nicaraguan journalists who are currently imprisoned in inhumane conditions for speaking out against the abuses of the Nicaraguan government. They are being persecuted because they became the voice, the eyes and ears of a people that was being murdered by their own government. Right now, they were declared terrorists. They were charged with inciting violence, all because they were doing the job of good journalists of reporting the truth of what was going on in Nicaragua. And my question and my request to everyone here is to stand with them and to demand their immediate and unconditional release, as well as the unconditional release of 700 prisoners of conscience in Nicaragua. The government of Nicaragua must be reminded that journalism is not a crime, demanding justice is not a crime, and you cannot silence the truth by imprisoning journalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll take a few more. The gentleman here and then the gentleman there.
Hello, how you doing? My name is Angel Villanueva. I just want to say thank you to the panel. I just wanted to make a couple comments, being that it was stated earlier that 60 journalists were being detained and 80 killed. I'm not sure exactly where. I just wanted to say, you know, it's outrageous that nobody knew in this day and age that we would be punished for doing our jobs. I feel like one thing as humans, we have to remember that technology is not the answer to all. Technology is as perfect as the human that is creating it. Being so that all these blogs, all these information that you're going to get is going to be as perfect as the person that's implementing all the information. I think that us humans should know that technology should not be used as a solution, but more as a tool, as a guide, as a helping hand, to help us get the news and information out as quickly as possible and to a broader audience. Another statement that social media is used as a tool for social media, especially in this millennial, being that technology has expanded and being that I'm pretty sure 99% of everybody in this room has a cell phone or has some type of social media. Wanted to make a comment on Mr. Alder. I believe he stated earlier how schools should be teaching how to pretty much determine the difference between real and fake news. I just wanted to agree with the statement. I feel like kids these days and certain aspects, adults are not educated on this. Being so, reading information that is biased from different blogs and different other websites causes adults and children to form biased opinions and to make biased decisions. So I feel like in general, a big thing is noting that technology is not perfect and, doing your research and being informed on the things that you are reading so that you do not form these biased decisions or, you're not misinformed on certain information. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lamborghini. I'm a musician, but I chose to be here today to particularly celebrate every journalist in the room. Apart from being a musician, I'm also a global prison ambassador. I'm the only musician advocating strongly for prison reform in Nigeria, my country, across Africa. I've started here in America. I've been to the UK as well to perform in prisons. And it is important that the role of journalism cannot be underplayed in any form. Without you guys in this room, a lot of the stories that have seen daylight would never, have seen daylight. So I just want to use this opportunity to say thank you to every journalist in the room. Thank you to every journalist out there on the field. Thank you to even the journalists that are still aspiring to become a voice in the society. Thank you all very much. And please, if you guys don't mind, I want everybody in the room to just scream, ole, ole, oh, to every journalist here. Are you ready? Are you ready? So at the count of 3, we're going to scream, ole, ole, oh, to every journalist across the world. 1, 2, 3. Ole, ole, oh.
Thank you for that. Please. And then.
Bonjour à tous. Merci. Je suis...
Thank you. I come from Mali. I'm a journalist by training. I studied in Cuba. I studied communications. And at present, I am an advisor on communications in the permanent mission of Mali. I also have a website online to promote women's rights. Because I worked in public media, and I realized that women's representation in the media is really very, very meager, because we are viewed as those who are to appear on the screen. Women are not in the field. Women are victims of war, but women are not part of the major reporting systems, and that is deplorable. In Mali, we are very few, and we're always limited to domestic reporting, which means that we are not really free to complain about violations against women, to bring about a greater awareness about violence against women. And I think that what many people have to do when they participate in public media, if you feel that you're limited, in your freedom of expression, you need a space where you can promote your message, where you can contribute to development and to awareness on the part of society. This is what I would like to say to those who are younger. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take this comment, and then we'll have a round of comments from the panelists. Please.
I would like to applaud the panelists for your excellent speech. So I am actually a college student, and I am a firm supporter of politically correct speech. I think that it is a crucial agent, especially on college campuses, to create an inclusive community for everyone. But I also heard a lot of opposing arguments that politically correct speech can restrict freedom of expression. And I was just wondering your opinion on this issue. How can journalists balance being politically correct while still expressing their opinions? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great point to stop and maybe take reactions from the floor. Maybe we'll start with Warren. Since you spoke about your 5 decades of experience, we'll see it.
I just want to, on that last point about political correctness and how do you, I would go back to what I said before. Impartiality is the answer to that kind of thing. Political correctness is a phrase that's used too often, I think, to suppress a point of view which you don't like. I just don't think it ought to enter into the debate. Be impartial. This word objective, now disdain, but the word we kind of grew up with in the American press. That's the answer to your question. That's how to strike the balance. And trying to be politically correct or incorrect is, I think, following a wrong path. I mean, that should not be on the journalist's mind. The journalist's mind, I can remember when I was doing investigative reporting in particular about heinous situations and about a person who I personally had zero respect for. I would afterwards read that before filing it and imagine, would that person feel that he or she had been fairly dealt with? In other words, that their point of view had been presented. And when I thought I had done that, there was enormous satisfaction in thinking you had offered up a situation which might engender, somebody's opposition or favoritism, but without showing your own view of the situation. That's going back to impartiality. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but that still remains the model. And as I said before, young people now are not growing up with many examples of that and how effective it is. It still is the best way.
Thank you. Would you like to come in?
Sure.
Please. And then Stephen.
So I'm an advocate for inclusivity in my own journalism. I care about having diverse voices in my journalism. I care about diversity in the newsroom. And I think that having diverse representation in newsrooms helps us to be better, not only just be better journalists, but to make sure that we are representing all of the beautiful voices that are out there. I want to go back to another comment about what's taught in schools about media literacy, as one of my co-panelists offered as one of the solutions. And I absolutely agree. I think media literacy is crucial. On the other hand, all of the media literacy in the world is not going to save us if the tech companies are just giving us a stream of garbage on social media. Like, we're not magical. Like, we can't fight against a tide that strong. So it is about media literacy plus responsibility on the part of the platforms, which are actually publishers. And I think we also need to think about how much are we paying teachers? Because if we want people to teach our children media literacy, and if we want our students to be computationally literate, we really need to look at the pay disparity between what Silicon Valley engineers are paid and what teachers are paid, and we need to really be honest with ourselves about what are we paying our teachers. We probably need to pay them more, honestly, and we need to be honest with ourselves about how pay rates indicate value. And so if we're not paying teachers enough, we're not valuing education enough, and that's going to have ramifications.
Thank you, Meredith.
Well, I want to wholeheartedly agree on teacher pay because both of my kids are going into teaching, and I would greatly like them to get paid a little more. I guess what I want to talk about is both diversity and objectivity together. So we're in an unusual situation at Reuters because we're a truly global news organization. We're not an American organization. We have journalists in over 200 locations around the world in 166 countries. And the only way we have been able to do journalism around the world is to ask people to put their opinions to the side. And whatever nationality they are, there may be Egyptians in Egypt, there may be Tunisians in Algeria, there may be Ukrainians in Russia, whoever is doing that journalism is not doing it as a citizen of that country. They're doing it as a practitioner of a craft so that our customers, our readers everywhere in the world can get the best information they possibly can. So I haven't been on a panel in 3 or 4 years that had 2 panelists who actually believed in objectivity, because it's not just that people have failed to do it, it's that ideologically the trend is away from it. And most panels I'm on, the editor-in-chief of the other news organization says that objectivity is hypocritical, it's not true, everybody has an agenda. You're being hypocritical by pretending to be objective when we all know you have an opinion. And my answer to that is, sure, I've got opinions, everybody's got opinions, but like a doctor or a dentist or a baseball player or any other professional, I have a craft, and my craft is to figure out what's going on out there, to sort the information, to listen closely, to do my best, make my best effort to find out what happened and to present it honestly and dispassionately and let you make the decisions. And again, I think I've become very antiquarian in this, but I still believe in it because I think it is the essence of great journalism. And when you're running a news organization that's global, there would be no other way to do it. It's the only way we can do journalism.
Alex, do you wish to?
Yes, I'd like to address a couple of the questions. First of all, the young woman from Mali. I appreciated your comments very much on the role of women in journalism. I believe there have been some improvements here in my country, in the United States, over the last 20 years, but I still believe there is a differentiation. I think you're more likely to see a young woman on TV than covering the battlefield. And I think that although women actually make up the majority of students in journalism and communications programs here at universities, and I suspect that's true in other countries as well, that the really competitive beats, the war correspondence, the top political correspondence, they're still more likely to be done by men. So there's still room for improvement here as well, and I think it's a very, very important point. And I actually do think it does connect with our theme of technology and disinformation here, because I think that women reporters, and perhaps even more so young women reporters on TV, because they're seen, they're known, their face is out there, they're more likely to be targeted online for either disinformation, for threats, even excessive appreciation by fans, you know, because they see them on TV. I think that's a real problem, and it can inhibit potentially women's careers if they choose to do less controversial things or perhaps do less on social media. So that's a real problem that we still have to decide how to deal with. In terms of the question of impartiality, I'll blow your mind and say I also agree with it. So we have definitely the panel for that. And I actually have to say, briefly, I don't want to describe the whole program, but I'm representing the Society of Professional Journalists in a program that Reporters Without Borders is doing called the Journalism Trust Initiative. And it's a long program, but we're looking at trust indicators, just briefly. But we actually discussed this very point of the word impartiality versus objectivity in detail. And I definitely think objectivity, that word is now considered passé, and I remember hearing jokes, not recently, but in the past, not as part of this program, that the only objective journalist is a dead journalist, that we all have opinions. But impartiality, I think, is a goal to aspire to. If we can all make our news reporting as impartial as possible and as fair to the subjects, even when we find the subjects reprehensible, that's a worthy goal. And of course, we should separate that from opinion journalism. Opinion journalism is very valued on the op-ed page, the editorial page. That's okay to express opinions there, but I'm talking about news reporting here, and I do think for the young journalists and journalism students in the room that you should aspire to impartiality.
Thank you, Alex. How many students of journalism are in the room? Can you raise your hands? Yeah. Any of you want to add a question? We have time for 2 questions. Okay, so 1 and 2. Yes. Start with you and then you.
Hi, my name is Carmen. I'm a grad student at Columbia University, and I'm a journalist. I have a question about social media. During today's session, we've talked a lot about misinformation and the dangers of social media. And we discussed deepfakes, information overload, bots, propaganda, and so on. But all of this takes place within platforms. So my question is, should there be more regulatory pressure on social media companies such as Facebook? And should they be regulated as publishers? I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes.
喂，各位好，我是一位来自中国的。
I'm an ordinary citizen from China. First of all, I would like to thank you for listening to my question, and also the panelists for your presentations, and also thank the simultaneous interpreters. We are talking about the freedom of the press. On this issue, we all know that there are certain things we can see, like violent acts, but certain things are silent. So my question is, regarding the freedom of the press, how the United Nations is trying to promote this concept in China and how it works in cooperation with the Chinese government. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the clock there. We have 5 minutes. We'll turn to the panel to address those 2 questions and maybe any final thoughts on this morning's session and this discussion. So we'll turn it over. Maybe we can start with Alex, and then we go this way.
Okay, well, the last questioner again asked about what the United Nations is doing, which I'm not the person on the panel to speak about. I don't know enough about what the United Nations does in particular countries. But I will pass on that and come back. Okay.
Previous question.
Oh.
The one on regulatory pressure, social media.
Oh, yes, the regulatory pressure. Yes, that is a very, actually, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was trying to formulate if there was anything I could say the second, but I can't. But the regulatory question is, in fact, a very interesting one. Of course, the platforms insist that they are like the phone company. They are not publishers. Clearly, they do not have prior approval. They are not like editors reviewing copy or images before they go online. On the other hand, as they increasingly employ not only algorithms, but small armies of human editors, essentially, they call them social media managers, I think, to screen out content, they are becoming more like publishers after the fact. In other words, they're not involved in the actual production of the content, but they are actually becoming increasingly curators of the selection of the content, which I do think actually opens them up to regulation as publishers.
You know, I don't know yet where I am on the social media regulation question. It's one of the hardest questions we in the industry face. On the one hand, I'm a strong supporter of the First Amendment and free expression. On the other hand, there are really bad things happening on social media. So maybe ask me next year, and maybe I'll have formulated more of an answer. If this is my closing comment, I just want to say one thing about two organizations I care very much about, and I want to just talk a bit about what they do. One is Committee to Protect Journalists, where I'm on the board, and CPJ has become even more important than it ever was before because of how much more dangerous it is around the world. And fortunately, there's been a lot more support for CPJ in the past year or two, and it's enabled it to do more things. But both in terms of guaranteeing, of helping people who are in trouble get out of trouble and supporting them, but also starting to get more proactive at helping people understand how to be safe out there. So it's an organization that is very open and looks for participation from people, so I hope people will be aware of how important that is. The second issue that's becoming incredibly important in the U.S. Is the legal protection for journalists. And the other board I'm on is Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And it is primary function is to make sure that the legal protections for journalists in the U.S. are there. And it joins amicus briefs, it files suits on behalf of journalists, and it is just about to start a program to place lawyers in localities around the country so that journalism organizations that don't have the funding to have high-powered lawyers will have lawyers to help protect their rights and get access around the world. The fact that so many good journalists and so many people around the country are volunteering both to support and to participate in these organizations is a really positive sign, so it increases my optimism, and I'm very proud to be part of those two organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Meredith?
So should social media companies be regulated? Yes. And are they publishers? Yes. That's my answer.
Any final points?
I would like to do it, actually. I have a lot of opinions on how they should be regulated. And I also have a lot of opinions on the code that would be necessary in order to regulate the social media companies. So I'm totally happy to wax at great length about that at some other point. In terms of press freedoms, I want to just bring up a sort of essential conflict of technology and of the way technology is implemented nowadays, a core philosophy of building technology. So many people write code of this philosophy that they want to write it once and run it anywhere. And that works beautifully for something like a word processing program. Because yes, you're just typing and you're printing out the words or visualizing them, and it's fine. Like, absolutely, yes, you can write a word processing program and write it once and run it anywhere, and that's great. But a social media program is different. And so we've been imagining that the code that runs Facebook or Twitter is the same as the code that runs Google Docs, and they're qualitatively different because with something like Twitter or Facebook, you do have to make judgments about what is hate speech, what is not hate speech, in order to comply with the laws of the individual country. And you don't have that same kind of collision with laws on social policy as you do with a word processing program, right? So we just need more nuance to the way we think about different kinds of programs. Maybe one of the solutions is we don't lump all technology together. We just add more nuance to the way we look at technology and think about what are we building and for what.
Thank you. Warren?
When the Sri Lankan government temporarily shut down access to American social media services like Facebook and Google's YouTube after the bombings there on Easter morning, Kara Swisher, you may know the name, she's an excellent technology writer. She's an opinion writer for the New York Times. She covers technology, and she is a champion, as I am, and as Stephen just said he is, of open and unfettered journalism. But she said her first reaction on hearing the news that they had shut down the social media was, quote, good, unquote. And I brought this with me. Good because it saves lives. Good because the companies that run these platforms seem incapable of controlling the powerful global tools they have built. Good because the toxic digital waste of misinformation that floods these platforms has overwhelmed what was once so very good about them. She said, "It pains me as a journalist and someone who once believed that a worldwide communications medium would herald more tolerance to admit this, to say that my first instinct was to turn it off. Social media was once credited with helping foster democracy in places like Sri Lanka, but is now blamed for an increase in religious hatred. Shutting down social media in times of crisis is not going to work, but we must have, and I'm now reading her words, but we must have a global discussion on how to handle the resulting disaster well beyond adding more moderators or better algorithms."
Thank you, Warren. And I think on this point, and building on the sixth threat that the Secretary General identified in his speech 2 years ago, the Secretary General appointed, and the report will be coming out next month, a high-level panel on digital technology. It is co-chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma, and they are with 20-member high-level panel from across sectors looking at specifically these issues. The report will be presented to the Secretary General in mid-June and then will be made public. And I think this is the way to have to look at these, where are we going, and whether it's regulation or not regulation. I don't think it is the Secretary General or us who will decide. It will be an issue for governments and member states. But I think on the position of the United Nations on press freedom, we are organizing this event, so the statement of the Secretary General was very clear. The principles on which we promote and we stand for. We stand for free press because also facts matter, because a rule-based world is the one that we want to live in, is the one that we want our children to grow in. Thank you all. You've been an amazing audience. It's a very distinguished and amazing panel. I would like to thank every one of you for being with us. And till next year, hopefully there'll be many less or no names on the list that Valerie will have to read next year. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.